May 12th, 1945. 6:30 inches the morning. A railway siding near the village of Ashwell. The morning mist hung low over the platform as the freight train hissed to a stop. Inside the wooden carriages, 200 German soldiers sat in silence. They'd been at war for 6 years. Now they were prisoners on enemy soil, exhausted, hungry, and uncertain what awaited them. Through the slats they could see green fields stretching toward the horizon, so different from the bombed cities and muddy trenches they'd left behind. The door slid open. British guards gestured them out. One by one, they climbed down onto English ground. What happened next would echo across decades in ways none of them could have imagined. The men expected shouting, perhaps beatings. They'd heard stories of what happened to prisoners, but the guards simply formed them into lines and began walking them down a narrow country lane. Hedgerows bloomed with hawthorn. Birds sang. The air smelled of rain and fresh earth. It felt impossibly peaceful. At the edge of the village, farm workers stopped their labor to watch the column pass. The Germans kept their eyes down, bracing for hatred. Instead, they heard nothing. No jeers, no curses. The camps were overcrowded. Food was scarce everywhere, but Britain's farms were critically short of workers. Most young men were still overseas. The Women's Land Army had done remarkable work, but the harvest couldn't wait. So the government made a decision that shocked many. Send prisoners to work the fields. Let enemy soldiers help feed the nation they'd tried to destroy. By 1945, Britain had taken in hundreds of thousands of German and Italian prisoners of war. They arrived in waves. Defeated men from North Africa, from France, from the collapsing Reich itself. The British public was divided. Some saw cheap labor. Others saw an insult to the dead. But the potatoes needed digging and the wheat needed cutting, and ideology doesn't fill empty stomachs. In Ashwell, the prisoners were billeted in a requisitioned manor house on the outskirts. The building was drafty and cold, but it had a roof and beds. That first night, they were given soup and bread. Not much, but more than some had eaten in weeks. A few of the older men wept quietly. They'd survived the war. Now they just wanted to survive the peace. The soup was thin, mostly water and turnips, but it was hot. They ate standing in the manor's great hall, beneath portraits of English nobility who'd never imagined German soldiers would sleep beneath their gaze. The guards watched but didn't harass them. One prisoner asked about latrines in halting English. A guard pointed. That was all. No mockery, no violence, just directions. Some of them couldn't sleep that first night despite the exhaustion. They lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of an English countryside at peace. An owl called from the nearby woods. Somewhere, a dog barked. Wind moved through the eaves of the old house. These were sounds they'd forgotten existed. For 6 years, the soundtrack had been artillery, aircraft engines, screaming. This silence felt alien, almost threatening in its gentleness. Klaus Richter lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling. He was 31, though he looked 50. His face was hollow, his body thin as wire. Before the war, he'd worked his father's farm in Bavaria, 20 hectares of apple orchards and grain fields in the shadow of the Alps. He knew the weight of a scythe, the smell of turned earth, the patience required to graft a fruit tree. He knew these things the way other men knew weapons. He'd been conscripted in 1939, sent to Poland, then France, then the long nightmare of the Eastern Front. He'd survived Stalingrad, survived the retreat, surrendered to the British in the chaos of Germany's collapse because the alternative was worse. His wife and 2 children were somewhere in Bavaria, if they'd survived the bombing. He hadn't heard from them in 8 months. 3 cots over, Ernst Bauer stared at the same ceiling. He was 24, a clerk from Hamburg who'd never touched a plow in his life. The army had taught him to shoot and dig trenches and run when the artillery started. It hadn't taught him anything about farming. When they'd been told they'd be working farms, he'd felt a spike of fear. He'd disappoint them. They'd punish him for being useless. But tonight, with soup in his belly and a roof overhead, Ernst allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe they'd just survived the worst of it. Maybe the British would work them hard but feed them. Maybe in a few months, when the repatriation started, he'd get home to find his mother's apartment still standing, his little sister still alive. The next morning arrived cold and gray. They were woken at dawn by guards who moved through the manor ringing a handbell. The prisoners rose stiffly, dressed in the same clothes they'd worn for days. Breakfast was porridge, watery but filling, and weak tea. Then they were assembled in the courtyard. A British officer stood on the manor steps with a clipboard. He read out names in heavily accented German, grouping them into work details. 4 men to Whitley, 6 to Morrison, 5 to the Henderson farm. The names meant nothing to them. They were being distributed like equipment. Thomas Whitley arrived at 7:30 in a truck that had seen better days. He was 62, his back bent from decades of labor, his hands gnarled as tree roots. His face was deeply lined, weathered by sun and wind and grief. He wore wool trousers and a thick jacket despite the spring warmth. Old men feel the cold differently. The officer called out 4 names: Klaus Richter, Ernst Bauer. 2 others, Hans Müller and Otto Kraus. They stepped forward with the small canvas bags that contained everything they owned. Whitley looked at them for a long moment. His eyes were gray as the morning sky. He said nothing. He gestured to the truck bed. They climbed in. No one spoke as they pulled away from the manor, as the village of Ashwell slipped past, as the road narrowed and curved through the countryside. Richter sat with his back against the cab, watching England unfold. Everything was so green. Even after 6 years of war, the fields looked untouched, orderly, peaceful. In Germany, everything had been bombed or burned or trampled. Here, lambs grazed in meadows. Stone walls divided the land in neat parcels. It looked like something from before the world ended. Ernst gripped the side of the truck and tried not to be sick. The fear was back. What if this farmer was cruel? What if he worked them until they collapsed? What if this was where the real punishment began? The British had been kind so far, but that couldn't last. Kindness didn't survive wars. The drive took 15 minutes. Whitley's farm appeared gradually, first as a barn roof visible over a hill, then as a cluster of buildings arranged around a muddy yard. The main house was stone, 2 stories, old but well-maintained. The barn was larger than the house. Fields stretched in every direction, some freshly plowed, others waiting for attention. Whitley parked the truck and climbed out slowly. His joints protested. Everything hurt these days. He'd lost his wife 2 years ago, cancer that took her in 4 months, lost his son James at Dunkirk in 1940, shot on the beach while waiting for evacuation. His nephew had died in North Africa, killed at El Alamein. The war had taken everyone he loved and left him with 100 acres he was too old to manage alone. He looked at the 4 Germans standing in his yard. Enemy soldiers. Men who might have killed James, might have fired the guns that cut down British boys on French beaches. The anger was there, buried deep but still hot. But above the anger was exhaustion. He needed help. The north field had to be plowed by week's end or the planting would be too late. He pointed to the barn, then to a shed where tools hung on the walls, plows and rakes and harnesses for the horses. Then to the north field visible beyond a stone wall. The field was large, maybe 8 acres, and completely unturned. It looked like an impossible amount of work. Klaus Richter stepped forward. He was clearly the one who spoke English, however broken. Whitley studied him. Thin as a scarecrow, but his eyes were intelligent. "The north field needs plowing," Whitley said slowly. "You know plows?" Richter nodded. "Yes. I am farmer. Bavaria." Something flickered across Whitley's face. Surprise, maybe. He'd expected soldiers, not farmers. Richter glanced back at Ernst. "Hans. Otto. They learn." Whitley grunted. It would have to do. He led them to the barn where 2 draft horses stood in their stalls. Massive creatures named Duke and Duchess. The plow hung on the wall, heavy iron that would take 2 men to move. Richter examined it, ran his hand along the blade. checked the harness connections. He nodded to himself. He knew this equipment. Not identical to what he'd used in Bavaria, but close enough. They spent an hour getting Duke harnessed, the plow attached, the lines arranged properly. Ernst fumbled with the leather straps until Richter showed him patiently in German how they fastened. Hans and Otto watched, trying to memorize the process. Whitley stood by the barn door and observed. They worked methodically, no wasted motion. Richter knew what he was doing. By mid-morning they were in the north field. Richter took the lines. Ernst and Hans walked alongside to help guide the plow when it caught on rocks. Otto brought water from the well in 2 wooden buckets. The sun had burned through the morning mist and the day was warming. The first furrow was rough. The plow bucked when it hit a buried stone and nearly threw Richter off his feet. But he steadied it, called to Duke in German, and the horse responded to the tone if not the words. The second furrow was better. By the third, they'd found a rhythm. Whitley watched from the gate. He'd expected complaining, excuses, the sullen resistance of men being punished. Instead, they worked. Richter's commands to the horse were clear and firm. Ernst jumped to move stones from the plow's path without being told. By noon, they'd turned nearly 2 acres. Whitley walked back to the house. His kitchen was empty, quiet in the way it had been since his wife died. He made himself tea and stood at the window watching the distant figures in the north field. They hadn't stopped. The plow carved its slow path back and forth, transforming the hard earth into dark, rich rows ready for seed. He thought about James. His boy had wanted to be a teacher, not a soldier. He'd been gentle, bookish, uncomfortable with violence. The army had taken him anyway, and the war had killed him. Whitley had received the telegram in June of 1940. Missing. Presumed dead. They never found the body. Just one more name in the long catalogue of the lost. These Germans in his field, they might have been at Dunkirk. Might have been the ones firing down at the beach. The thought made his hands shake. But they also might have been conscripts like James, men who didn't want war any more than his son had. There was no way to know. The war had ground up millions of men and turned them all into killers or corpses. By mid-afternoon, Whitley returned to the field with bread and cheese. He set the food on the stone wall without a word and walked away. When he came back an hour later, the bread was gone, but the work had continued. 3 acres turned now, maybe more. They were making better progress than he'd managed in years. At sunset, Whitley called them in. They put Duke and Duchess back in their stalls, hung the harness, stored the plow. Ernst's hands were blistered from work he wasn't used to. Hans walked with a limp from turning his ankle in a furrow, but none of them complained. They simply stood in the yard waiting for instructions. Whitley pointed to the barn. "You sleep there," he said. "Loft has straw, blankets in the tack room." Richter translated for the others. They nodded. It was better than many places they'd slept. "Breakfast at dawn," Whitley said. "Work starts at 7. "Yes," Richter said. "Thank you." Whitley didn't respond. He turned and walked to the house, his silhouette dark against the dying light. Behind him, the 4 Germans climbed the ladder to the barn loft. The space smelled of hay and horses and old wood. They spread blankets on the straw and lay down in the darkness. "He hates us," Ernst said quietly in German. "Maybe," Richter replied. "But he hasn't beaten us, hasn't starved us. That's more than I expected." "His son probably died because of us," Hans said. "You see how he looks at us?" "I see," Richter said. "But we're here anyway, so we work. We prove we're useful. Maybe that's enough." Otto, who'd barely spoken all day, said, "Do you think we'll ever go home?" No one answered. The question was too big, too painful. They lay in the darkness and listened to the horses moving in the stalls below, to the wind in the eaves, to the sounds of an English farm at night. Eventually, exhaustion pulled them under. The next morning arrived with rain. Whitley appeared at the barn door at dawn with 5 tin cups of tea. He set them on a workbench and left without speaking. The Germans found them there, still hot, steam rising in the cold morning air. They drank in silence, standing in the barn doorway watching rain fall across the fields. It was a small thing, just tea. But Ernst felt something loosen in his chest. Maybe they wouldn't die here. Maybe this old man with his gray eyes and his dead son would let them work and survive and someday, somehow, find their way home. Richter held his cup in both hands, feeling the warmth seep into his cold fingers. He thought about his own farm in Bavaria, about mornings like this when he'd drink coffee with his father before heading to the orchards. That world felt impossibly distant now, separated not just by miles but by war and death and everything that couldn't be undone. But here, holding a cup of tea in an English barn while rain drummed on the roof, he felt the smallest flicker of something he'd thought was dead. Not hope exactly. Something quieter. The possibility that the world might contain small kindnesses again. That he might wake up tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. That survival might be possible. The rain stopped by mid-morning. They returned to the north field, to the patient work of turning earth. Duke and Duchess pulled the plow through mud now, their hooves sucking at the wet ground. It was harder work, but they pressed on. By afternoon, when pale sun broke through the clouds, they'd added another acre to the total. 4 days later, the north field was finished. 8 acres of dark, furrowed earth, ready for planting. Whitley walked the field at dusk, running his hands through the soil. It was good work, better than he could have managed alone in twice the time. He stood at the field's edge as the sun set, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not quite gratitude, but close to it. The next morning, he brought 6 cups of tea to the barn instead of 5. 1 for each of the 4 Germans, 1 for himself. He stood with them in the doorway, watching the dawn light spread across the fields they'd plowed together. Nobody spoke, but something had shifted, subtle as the changing light. That afternoon, while they were repairing fence posts near the south pasture, one of the harness straps broke. It was old leather, dried and cracked, and it simply gave way under stress. Whitley swore he'd need to drive to the village for a replacement, lose half a day to the trip. But Richter was examining the broken strap. He pulled a knife from his pocket and some cord he'd salvaged from somewhere. He worked quickly, making a series of cuts and knots, reinforcing the weak point with the cord woven through the leather in a pattern Whitley didn't recognize. 10 minutes later, he handed it back. Whitley tested it, pulled hard. The repair held. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional, maybe stronger than the original. He looked at Richter, really looked at him for the first time. "Where'd you learn that?" "My father," Richter said. "He teach me to fix things. On farm, always something broken." Whitley nodded slowly. "Your father still alive?" Richter's face closed. "I don't know. I don't know anything since 8 months." The silence stretched between them, heavy with all the things that couldn't be said. Whitley cleared his throat. "Well, good work. Saved me a trip." It wasn't much. Just an acknowledgement that Richter had done something useful, something skilled, without being asked. But it was the first time Whitley had spoken to any of them as if they were men rather than just labor. Richter felt it, the small shift in the air between them. That evening, after they'd finished work and put away the tools, Whitley appeared at the barn with bread and a wheel of cheese. He set it on the workbench, where he'd left the tea that morning. "For your supper," he said gruffly. Then he turned and walked away before anyone could respond. Ernst stared at the food. "Is this a trick? Will he take it back?" "No," Richter said quietly. "I don't think so." They divided the bread and cheese carefully, equal portions for each man. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd been given. They ate slowly, making it last, sitting on hay bales in the barn as the light faded outside. "I think maybe we'll be all right here," Hans said eventually. Richter didn't answer, but he allowed himself to think it might be true. The old man was softening, degree by degree. The work was hard but honest. The food was plain but regular. They had shelter and no one beat them, and sometimes, in the morning, there was tea waiting. It was more than millions of men had. It was enough to build small hopes on. 2 weeks became 3. The planting began. Potatoes in the east field, barley in the west. They worked dawn to dusk, their hands hardening, their bodies remembering the rhythm of farm labor. Ernst stopped fumbling with the equipment. Otto learned to read Whitley's silent gestures. Hans discovered he had a talent for the patient work of thinning seedlings. And every morning, Whitley brought tea to the barn, sometimes 6 cups. Sometimes he stayed and drank his with them, standing in the doorway watching the sun rise. He never said much, but he was there, sharing the quiet morning, and that meant something. One evening, as they were washing at the pump in the yard, Richter noticed Whitley watching them from the kitchen window. Their eyes met for a moment. Whitley didn't look away, didn't smile, just held his gaze for a few seconds before turning back into the house. It was nothing, just a moment. But Ernst saw it too, and later, lying in the loft, he said, "I think he sees us now." "Maybe," Richter said. "Or maybe he's just tired of hating. Either way, we're still here." The spring deepened into early summer. The fields they'd planted began to show green shoots. The work continued, endless and necessary. And every morning there was tea, and every evening there was bread. And slowly, degree by degree, the space between enemy and something else began to narrow. Whitley didn't forgive them. How could he forgive the war, the loss of his son, the years of grief? But he stopped seeing them as the men who killed James. He started seeing them as the men who fixed his harness, who turned 8 acres in 4 days, who worked without complaint through rain and heat and exhaustion. He started seeing them as men who were trying to survive, same as him. The north field they'd plowed together turned green with young wheat. In the evenings, Whitley would walk its perimeter and feel something almost like peace. The work went on. The earth responded to care regardless of who provided it. Maybe that was enough. One morning at the end of May, Whitley brought 6 cups of tea and a small tin of biscuits. He set them on the workbench and paused. Richter and the others had just climbed down from the loft, still pulling on their boots. "The east field looks good," Whitley said. Not to anyone in particular. Just a statement. "Yes," Richter replied. "Potatoes will be ready in 2 months." Whitley nodded. Then, almost reluctantly, he added, "You do good work. All of you." It was the first praise he'd given, the first acknowledgement that they were more than just captured labor. Ernst felt his throat tighten. Hans blinked rapidly. Even Otto, usually stoic, looked away to hide his expression. "Thank you," Richter said quietly. "We try our best." Whitley cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotion in the barn. "Right. Well, drink your tea before it gets cold. The south pasture fence needs replacing today." He left quickly, but the words hung in the air after he'd gone. They drank their tea and ate the biscuits, and something that had been tightly wound in each of them loosened slightly. They were being seen, not forgiven. And for men who'd been invisible, who'd been just numbers in a defeated army, that was everything. The work continued. The seasons turned, and in a barn on a farm in Ashwell, a fragile bridge was being built, 1 cup of tea at a time, 1 day of shared labor at a time. Across a chasm, the war had carved between men who, in another world, might have been friends. 6 weeks later, the farm had settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. The morning tea ritual was established. Richter knew which fields needed attention without being told. Ernst had developed calluses thick enough that he no longer winced when gripping the plow handles. Hans could harness Duke and Duchess in 10 minutes flat. Otto had discovered a talent for machinery repair, spending evenings in the barn fixing things Whitley had thought beyond salvation. The village, however, had not settled into anything resembling acceptance. On a Saturday evening in late June, Whitley drove into Ashwell for supplies. The general store was crowded, farmers and their wives collecting rations and exchanging news. When Whitley entered, the conversation didn't stop exactly, but it shifted, became pointed. "Evening, Thomas," said Robert Morrison, who farmed the land adjacent to Whitley's. "How are your Germans working out?" The emphasis on "your" was deliberate. Whitley kept his face neutral. "They work hard. No complaints." "Heard you're feeding them from your own kitchen now," said Morrison's wife. "Considering what?" Whitley asked quietly. "Considering they're the reason half the boys from this village didn't come home." The store went silent. Everyone was listening now. Whitley felt the weight of their judgment. Their grief turned to anger that needed a target. He understood it. He'd felt it himself, still felt it some mornings when he woke and remembered James was gone. "They're farm workers," Whitley said evenly. "I feed them so they can work. Same as I'd feed any laborer." "It's not the same," Morrison said. His voice had hardened. "My nephew died in France, killed by Germans. And now we're supposed to give them tea and biscuits and pretend it's all fine." "I'm not pretending anything's fine," Whitley said. He collected his supplies and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "But the work needs doing, and hating them won't bring the dead back." He walked out into the evening air, his hands shaking slightly. The drive home was quiet. He thought about James, about the telegram, about the empty place at the table that would never be filled. He thought about Richter's hollow eyes and the photograph of children the man hadn't seen in 3 years. He didn't know what he felt anymore. The anger was still there, but it was complicated now by something else. Recognition, maybe. The shared understanding of men who'd both lost everything to the same brutal machinery. Back at the farm, the 4 Germans were finishing evening chores. They'd learned to read Whitley's moods, and tonight they kept their distance. Something had happened in the village. They could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way he moved with barely controlled tension. Whitley went into the house without a word. They ate their supper in the barn and didn't speak of it. 2 days later, Whitley's daughter arrived unannounced. Margaret was 34, unmarried, working in a London typing pool. She'd taken the train down for her monthly visit, carrying a small case and wearing the exhausted look of someone who'd been navigating bomb-damaged streets and rationing queues for too long. She found her father in the east field, inspecting the potato plants. "Dad," she called. Whitley turned, and his face softened. "Maggie, didn't know you were coming. Wanted to surprise you." She hugged him, felt how thin he'd become. "You're not eating enough." "I eat fine." They walked back toward the farmhouse together. That's when Margaret saw them. 4 men working in the south field, German prisoners unmistakable in their worn Wehrmacht trousers and British-issued work shirts. She stopped cold. "Dad, those are Germans. They're farm workers," Whitley said carefully. "They're prisoners of war. They're Dad. How can you stand having them here? I need the help. Get someone else. Anyone else." Her voice was rising. "James died because of them. How can you give them food and shelter like they're people you care about?" Whitley was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low. "They didn't kill James. Maggie, the war killed James. These men are just trying to survive. Same as us. They wore the uniform. They fought for Hitler. Most of them were conscripted. They didn't have choices any more than our boys did." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I can't believe you're defending them." "I'm not defending anyone. I'm just too tired to keep hating." Whitley looked toward the field where Richter and the others were working, unaware of being watched. "They work hard. They're respectful. One of them is a farmer. Reminds me of..." He stopped. "Reminds me of how James might have been if he'd gotten to come home." Margaret wiped her eyes roughly. "I'm going inside. I can't talk about this." She spent the visit avoiding the Germans, staying in the house while they worked. But she watched from the kitchen window, watched her father bring them tea in the morning, watched them repair a section of fence with quick efficiency, watched Richter show the others how to thin the wheat seedlings without damaging the plants, patient as a teacher. On her last evening, she was reading in the sitting room when she heard voices outside. Laughter. She went to the window and saw her father standing with Richter near the barn, both of them looking at something on the ground. Ernst had apparently slipped in the mud near the pig pen and gone down hard, landing face first in the slop. He was covered in filth, and the others were laughing, not cruel laughter, but the kind that happens when someone survives something embarrassing and everyone's relieved they're all right. Even her father was smiling. Not a big smile, but real. She hadn't seen him smile since before James died. Margaret turned from the window, something uncomfortable moving in her chest. She didn't know what to do with it. The anger was easier, but watching her father find something like companionship with these men who should have been enemies, it complicated everything. She left the next morning without resolving it. On the train back to London, she stared out at the countryside and tried to untangle her feelings. Maybe he needed to believe that not everything the war had touched was destroyed beyond repair. July brought a heat wave, then storms. The work intensified. Hay needed cutting before the rains came. The barley was almost ready for harvest. Every day was a race against weather and time. Richter had been teaching Whitley a grafting technique he'd learned from his father in Bavaria. The apple trees at the field's edge were old, several branches dead or diseased. But with careful cutting and grafting from healthier stock, they could be saved, even improved. Whitley watched Richter's hands move with practiced precision, making cuts at exact angles, binding the grafts with cords soaked in wax. In 3 years, these branches give better fruit, Richter explained in his careful English. My father, he teach me when I am boy. He say good farmer thinks in years, not days. Your father sounds like a wise man. Whitley said. He was. The bombing. Richter's voice trailed off. He focused on the graft. Didn't finish the sentence. Whitley understood. Another casualty. Another person swallowed by the war. Richter glanced at him, surprised. It was the first time Whitley had offered him anything like sympathy. Thank you, he said quietly. Then, hesitantly, your son, James. He was farmer too? Wanted to be a teacher, Whitley said. His throat was tight. He loved books, hated hunting, couldn't stand the thought of killing things. He laughed bitterly. So naturally the army taught him to shoot and sent him to France. They worked in silence for a while, binding the grafts, securing the future fruiting of trees that would outlive them both. The work required concentration, steady hands, patience. It was almost meditative. I have 2 children, Richter said eventually. Franz and Greta, 8 and 6. I don't know if. He couldn't finish that sentence either. Whitley set down his tools and looked at Richter properly. Really saw him. Not a German, not a prisoner, not even just a farm worker. A father separated from his children. A man carrying grief and fear the same as everyone else the war had touched. When this is over, Whitley said, when they let you go home, I hope you find them well. Richter's eyes were bright. He nodded, not trusting his voice. That night, the storm that had been threatening all week finally broke. It came in fast and violent, turning the sky black at 6 in the evening. Thunder shook the farmhouse windows. Lightning turned the fields white for split seconds at a time. Whitley was checking the animals when he heard the crack. One of the barn's main roof beams had given way under the weight of water and wind. He ran through the downpour and found the 4 Germans already there, staring up at the damage. Rain was pouring through a 6-foot gap, soaking the hay stored in the loft. If they lost the hay, they'd have nothing to feed the animals through winter. We have to save it, Whitley shouted over the storm. Get the hay out, get it under cover somewhere. They worked through the night, all 5 of them forming a chain, passing bales down from the loft, running them through the rain to the smaller shed that still had a roof. Their clothes were soaked through in minutes. Water ran in their eyes. Thunder crashed overhead like artillery. Ernst slipped on the ladder and nearly fell 10 feet before Otto caught him. Hans dropped a bale and it split open, scattering hay into the mud. They kept going. There was no choice. The work had to be done. At midnight, they'd saved about 2/3 of it. They stood in the shed, panting, covered in mud and hay and exhaustion. The storm was finally easing. Through the doorway, lightning still flickered, but the rain had gentled to a steady drum. Whitley looked at them. 4 men who'd been strangers 3 months ago. 4 men he'd been prepared to hate. 4 men who'd just spent 6 hours working themselves to collapse to save his farm. You didn't have to do that, he said. Richter wiped water from his face. Where else we go? This is... He searched for the English word. This is our place now, too. Something broke open in Whitley's chest. Not forgiveness, he didn't know if he'd ever forgive the war for what it took from him. But something else. Acceptance, maybe. The understanding that these men weren't his enemies anymore. Maybe they never really had been. He went to the house and came back with a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for no occasion he could name. He poured 5 measures into whatever cups and jars he could find. They drank standing in the shed doorway, watching the storm die, warming themselves from the inside. My son, Whitley said suddenly. James. He was 22 when he died. Never got to have a family. Never got to teach the students he wanted to help. Never got to see 23. He looked into his cup. He was a good boy. Better than me. I'm sorry, Richter said. The words were inadequate, but they were all he had. Whitley nodded. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. After a moment, Richter reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, creased photograph. 2 children stared at the camera. A boy and a girl with serious expressions in their father's eyes. Franz and Greta, Richter said. His voice was rough. I don't know if they're still alive. I don't know anything. Whitley looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he pulled out his wallet and removed his own worn picture. A young man in uniform, smiling at something off camera. Everything ahead of him still. James, Whitley said. They stood side by side. 2 fathers holding photographs of the people they'd lost or might have lost, separated by uniforms and borders, and a war that had tried to make them hate each other. The rain fell softly now. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Ernst was crying quietly. Hans had his face turned away, but his shoulders shook. Otto stood with his arms crossed, jaw clenched. They were all carrying the same weight, all grieving the same shapeless collection of losses. Whitley put his hand on Richter's shoulder. Just for a moment. Then he collected the cups and headed toward the house. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow we fix the roof. They watched him go. This old man who'd lost his son to their country's war, who'd chosen not to punish them for it, who'd just spent 6 hours in a storm working beside them as equals. I think, Ernst said in German, we may have found something worth surviving for. Richter folded the photograph carefully and put it back in his pocket. Maybe, he said. Maybe we have. The weeks became months. Summer turned to autumn. The harvest came in better than Whitley had managed in years. The apple trees they'd grafted together began to bud, promising fruit for seasons to come. The work continued, but it felt different now, less like punishment, more like purpose. The village remained divided, but Whitley stopped caring what they thought. He knew what he knew. These men had saved his farm. They'd worked with honor and dignity. They'd become something he hadn't expected to find again after James died. Companions in the daily work of living. In September, word came that repatriation would begin soon. The prisoners would be sent home as transport became available. Ernst was jubilant. Hans couldn't stop smiling. Otto allowed himself to believe he might see his wife again, but Richter was quiet. That evening, he found Whitley in the barn. When they send us back, he said carefully, I want to ask something. Go on. If I can come back, if British government allows, if I can get papers. Richter struggled with the words. I have no farm in Bavaria now. Maybe nothing at all. But here. He gestured around the barn, the fields beyond. Here is work. Here is. I don't know the word. Purpose? Home, Whitley suggested quietly. Yes. Maybe home. Whitley was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. I'll write a letter. To whoever needs to approve it. You've earned your place here, Klaus. You and the others. If they want to stay. Richter's eyes were bright. Thank you. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Bureaucracy is slower than farming. But I'll try. 2 years later, in the summer of 1947, Klaus Richter stood in the north field they'd plowed together that first week. He was still thin, but healthier now. The hollow look had left his eyes. In his pocket was a letter from his wife. She and the children had survived. They were coming to England. The British government had approved their immigration. Whitley approached across the field, moving slower now, his back more bent, but he was smiling. "Got word from Margaret," he said. "She's bringing someone down to meet you next month. A teacher from her building. Says you two might get along." Richter laughed. "Always the matchmaker. Just think you deserve some happiness," Whitley said. "You've worked hard enough for it." They stood together at the field's edge, looking at the wheat rippling in the breeze. The apple trees they'd grafted were heavy with fruit now. The Bavarian technique having worked exactly as Richter promised. Duchess grazed peacefully in the south pasture. Everything was green and growing. "You know," Whitley said. "James would have liked you. Would have appreciated the way you think about the land, about the future." "I would have liked to know him," Richter said. "Well, you know me. That'll have to be enough." They walked back to the farmhouse together, planning the next day's work, discussing the repairs needed before winter. Behind them, the fields stretched toward the horizon, testament to what could be built when men chose connection over hatred, when they chose to see each other as human despite everything that had tried to make them enemies. 1953. The small cottage at the edge of Whitley's property now housed a family. Klaus Richter, his wife Anna, and their children Franz and Greta, who were learning to speak English with thick German accents that made the village children giggle. Greta was fascinated by the horses. Franz had his father's talent for grafting fruit trees. Whitley was 70 now, unable to manage the farm alone. Richter had become his partner, not his employee. They'd formalized it with papers, contracts that recognized the truth everyone already knew. This was their farm together now. Ernst had gone back to Germany and found work as an accountant. Hans had married a girl from the next village over and settled in Cornwall. Otto had returned to his wife and never wrote, which everyone understood. Some men needed to forget, but Richter stayed. And the apple trees they'd saved together, the fields they'd plowed, the barn they'd repaired in the storm, all of it continued, season after season, growing into something neither man had imagined possible in that first tense week of silence and suspicion. 1974. Thomas Whitley died in his sleep at 91. The funeral was attended by half the village, including several people who'd condemned him years earlier for harboring Germans. They'd grown old enough to understand what he'd known early, that survival required letting go of hatred eventually, that the work of living was hard enough without carrying the war forever. Klaus Richter, now 60, stood at the grave and thought about the day he'd stepped off a train, expecting punishment, and found redemption instead. His son, Franz, grown now with children of his own, stood beside him. Franz worked the farm alongside Tom Whitley's grandson, a boy named after his great-uncle James. The two young men, one German, one English, had never known the war. They knew only the farm, the rhythm of seasons, the patient work their grandfathers had shared, the present. The apple trees Klaus Richter planted with Thomas Whitley in 1946 still stand at the edge of the north field. They're gnarled now, ancient by tree standards, but they still bloom every spring. White petals against green English hills, rooted in soil that doesn't remember borders. Franz Richter, elderly himself now, tends them alongside Tom Whitley's great-grandson. They use the Bavarian grafting technique that Klaus taught Thomas, that Thomas taught his grandson, that has been passed down like the land itself. Every spring when the trees bloom, Franz thinks about the stories his father told him, about a freight train and a morning mist, about an old man who chose connection over revenge, about tea brought to a field and photographs shared in silence, about a storm that forced them to work together and broke down the final walls between them. The war took 6 years. The peace they built together has lasted 3 times as long. This is the echo. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet sound of fruit falling into hands that learned, slowly, to reach across the space where enemies once stood. Just the patient work of men who chose to see each other as human, who plowed fields together until the earth beneath them stopped being English or German and became simply ground that responded to care. The land doesn't remember the war. It only knows the hands that have tended it, generation after generation, building something beautiful from the ruins of something terrible. And every spring, the apple trees bloom.